I'm really excited to be here today and to have this next conversation. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Shalini Ramanathan, the Vice President of Origination at RES. Judy McElroy, the CEO of Fractal Energy Storage Consulting. And Kurt Stowers, who I think is still maybe getting mic'd up back there. He is the Vice President of Origination at 8 Minute Solar. So. Kurt Stowers. Well, thank you all so much for being here today. And like Aaron Hardick mentioned, we'll be talking about business case for solar and storage. You all have a lot of experience in this industry that's constantly changing. So what are some of the top trends that you're seeing right now in the industry, and how have those changed over maybe the last 5 years? And Shalini, I'll start with you.
One of the things that has been really refreshing to me about this conference is that we've been talking about what we all do professionally, but also the broader world outside and how it affects us, how it affects what we do. And one of the trends that I've seen that I would love to kill is this myth that the real purpose of storage and solar is to help us all be off-grid and to help us all achieve independence. And I bet that none of us here think that, but I also bet, ask at Thanksgiving, that your families do. And I think that one of the reasons that this is such an unhelpful trend is it minimizes the impact that storage can really have, which to me is in supporting the grid, providing grid services, enhancing resiliency, improving reliability, all those things that are really important, but a lot less kind of exciting than the idea that you're going to be off the grid and utterly independent even in storm events. So I think that on the one hand, we're seeing a lot of really interesting business models and a lot of sophistication in the world of those of us who work professionally in the field. But I do think we have an obligation to communicate more broadly and say, look, stop dreaming of being off grid and let's all make the grid a lot better, and storage is a big part of that.
Judy, what about you?
We're kind of more in the weeds, sort of in the battle zone when it comes to storage and solar plus storage. We're designing and doing analysis and helping procure and oversee most of the projects going in. So we get a lot of data points. Over the last couple of years, the things that have changed is, the obvious one is, hey, prices have come down, both on the solar side and on the battery side. But on the battery side specifically, prices have come down about 60%. I remember about 5 years ago, it was about $600 a kilowatt hour for your DC block or your battery system. And now we're in some cases below $200 a kilowatt hour. And I always put an asterisk whenever I talk about price, because there's a lot of misleading and misrepresentation that happens in there. And then on the technology, we've seen some amazing advancements. So, the inverters, the power conditioning systems have become so much more reliable, so much more robust. The batteries have become more sophisticated, both the batteries and the battery management systems. We've seen a lot of changes in how the batteries are deployed, how they're operated, how they're cooled. So we had some of the major vendors in the industry trying to dip their toe in liquid cooling, and now we've all sort of, as an industry, have gravitated back toward air cooling the systems. So a lot of things have changed. And then also, we've seen this emergence and this sort of paralleled interest of both AC coupled and DC coupled solar and storage. And we're finally to the point where we have enough parts and pieces and players to make the DC coupled a reality whenever it makes sense. And then we also, over the last few years, kind of saw the coming and the going of the flow batteries. So I'm sure I'm going to hurt some people's feelings with something I say at some point today, so I'll apologize in advance. But I do want to speak candidly and let you know that it's just some things work and some things don't, and that's the way it is.
I think the main thing that we've seen, and what Judy emphasized, was the price coming down. And with price coming down, what that results in is a lot more interest in coupled battery storage projects. We strictly focus on PV, solar, PV, and battery storage. And what we've seen, in the last year or so is just about every RFP that comes out is asking for battery storage. They want to see a price on that, with the exception of like the corporates that really go on the virtual PPA route. With that, we see a wide, a wide range of details. Some of the utilities really know what they're looking for and are very specific on what they want priced out. Other ones are very general. Shoot us a storage proposal as well. We'll take a look at it. But everybody's becoming very interested in it, and it's because price is coming down so low. And especially when you get on the utility scale side and you're coupling batteries with it. Some of you may have seen a recent announcement that we had with a project in California with LADWP. We were awarded a contract, and that's one of the lowest prices for battery storage, PV and battery storage in the US. When you look at the distributed side, an interesting fact that I saw the other day, or an expectation, I should say, it's not a fact, it's an expectation, is that going forward by 2024, that 24% of distributed solar will include battery storage. So that's interesting. So it's not just on the utility side, it's also filtering down into the distributed side.
On the utility side, how can utilities really evaluate which projects will bring them the most value, the most return on their investment? How can they prioritize these projects?
Yeah, so Frank this morning from CPS mentioned that my company, Renewable Energy Systems, we have a project with CPS. It's a combined 5 megawatt solar, 10 megawatt battery storage facility. It's at substantial completion and not yet operational. And one of the interesting aspects of that is that CPS owns that. They're going to operate it. They're the lead on it, with, of course, support from RES. And it's really important if you want to maximize the value of battery storage. You need to think about who actually has operational control, because the use cases can change. It's very different from the wind and solar PPAs that a lot of us are used to, that are predicated on this unit contingent kind of production, and even in those, I'll say that we're seeing restrictions, especially corporates. Are saying, we don't want your system to be offline in August when the price might jump up to $9,000 a megawatt hour. So we're seeing, even in the wind and solar PPAs, we're seeing restrictions on operational parameters. Now, but if you take something like energy storage, where you have a lot more control over how that is deployed, I think that the short answer to your question, Aaron, is you have to be prepared for the grid to change. You have to be prepared for incentives to change. And so you really have to think about, even if you do a PPA, if you don't want to own, I think utilities have to think about, how can we write this contract in a way that really optimizes value? Because it's very easy for there to be misalignment in a PPA in terms of who bears costs and who gains rewards.
Judy, do you have thoughts on that?
Sure. I think there's a lot of gaps in this area. You said it great when you talked about how there's, some utilities know what they want, and most utilities don't know what they want when it comes to storage or solar plus storage. So we see a lot of these blanket generic RFPs coming out. There is a difference of what you can physically do with a storage asset or a solar plus storage asset versus what you can actually do. And what I mean is that, if I was a utility here in Texas, what I would love to do with PVS or S is I would love to be able to peak shave. I would love to be able to do ancillary services and shift energy and do it all with the same battery. But guess what? I can physically do that. I can do it all day long. But I can't, because there's policy in the way. So the first thing that I think that utilities need to do is they need to figure out, one, what type of utility am I? Am I a distribution service provider? Am I a transmission service provider? And then once you figure out what you are, you need to figure out what you're allowed to do given the current state rules. So there's different things that happen, right? So you have state policy. So here in Texas, we have our Texas Administrative Code, and that tells you what you can and can't do, whether you can own generation, whether you can do ancillary services, whether you can own or you can maybe be a buyer from somebody else. That's sort of an indirect reference to, Senate Bill 1941 that's happening right now, where there's some legislative push to see transmission service providers being able to procure storage services as a way to do a distribution deferral. And then, so even if you can get past what you can do from a state level, then you have to determine what you can do given the current market tariff. So based on your interconnection voltage, your asset size, the way that your asset is registered, now that's going to determine what services that you're allowed to do. In some cases, depending on your size, your interconnection location, your voltage, who you are, now maybe you're only allowed to do energy and ancillary services, or maybe given those parameters, you're only allowed to peak shave. And then if you're in front of the meter or behind the meter, so there's this entire matrix of what you can and can't do purely because of policy and rules. So I know that we talk a lot about, we need to do all these things to maximize the value of energy storage, but frankly, we can't. And in some cases, there's good reasons and rationales of why those rules are there. And those rules change when you go to other markets. So what we see here in ERCOT or Texas is very different than what you would see in New York and California. But that's, I think, the first starting point, is first finding out what you're allowed to do. And then secondly, you need to evaluate it purely as an investment. So you need to put the blinders on and put the green ambitions away, the political recognition away, and you need to say, does this make sense? By taking into account the CapEx, the OpEx, the performance, the degradation, baking it all into your cake, and then you need to look at that cake and you need to compare it to what the alternatives are, whether that be energy efficiency, demand response, putting in a new peaker plant, running that new distribution feeder. So I think that there's those different gates that you have to pass through, and you need to do it in a neutral and unbiased way, because at the end of the day, utilities are trying to make decisions that are going to be the best for their retail customers.
Kurtz, any follow-up there?
Yeah, I'll touch on a little slightly different aspect of it, and that is, what does a utility need to be successful and sustainable long term? And they need competitively priced generation and reliable generation, two main things, right? So when they're looking at that, they need to consider those factors in looking at, like solar and battery storage. And how do you get the competitive price aspect of it? And that typically comes with larger projects, utility scale projects, and then designing a storage system, engineering it to meet the needs of the utility. And like Judy was saying, what are you really trying to achieve? Peak shaving, I agree, very important in ERCOT. Time shifting of the energy, congestion management, deferring transmission upgrades, et cetera. So you have to take all that into consideration. And when you do that, and what we're seeing now with the prices where they've come down so much, solar and battery storage is, in most cases, beating new fossil generation. So, it makes a case for itself, but you do have to get into the weeds, and you need to really consider partnering with someone that understands that's been there, done that, and can really design a battery system that will meet the needs that you need. And another very important part is, how does it tie in with your existing fleet of generation? The optimization side of it, the software side of it. Does the software integrate correctly? Will it let you optimize and really capture the hourly volatility or intra-hour volatility in a market to create that additional revenue piece for you? So a lot to consider, but it can be done, and it's going to continue to grow and grow as the years go forward. More and more of the battery storage you're going to see coming in.
Yeah, just what Kurt mentioned earlier, that we're seeing a lot of RFPs. It's pretty much standard for utility RFPs to say, tell us about storage. And every time we get one of these RFPs, I think, aha, energy storage, the solution looking for a problem to solve. And that's actually great because as business people, that's what we do, right? We solve problems. So I think that there's a lot of deep thinking that needs to happen about exactly what the application is that adds value to your customer. And then as someone else mentioned this morning, you have to do that across this complex deregulated market. So maybe you have multiple customers, which adds that much more complexity to it.
Judy, you talked a little bit about policy a minute ago. So what role do you think policy will have, in the market going forward?
The low-hanging fruit opportunities for a lot of storage projects are participating in the ISO, wholesale administered markets, whether that be ancillary services, energy, capacity. We obviously don't have a capacity market here in our backyard, but those are very finite markets. So what happens after that? Well, here in Texas, it depends a lot on policy, and elsewhere it depends on policy as well. We don't have a big delta between our off-peak and our peak, nor are we forecasted to. So energy arbitrage is never going to be a big driver for putting in these types of systems. Right now, we see so many mandates that are happening. To date, I think we have 6 or 7 states that have mandates for energy storage, and I expect that to continue. And the reason being is because batteries, like renewable energy, have been put center stage on the political scene. People want to sort of outdo one another with how green they can go or how much storage they can put in. And it's good for people that are building and selling the storage, but it may not be so good for the people that end up paying for it. But right now, that's the biggest driver is what kind of mandates are going to come out, what kind of targets are going to come out, and what kind of incentives are going to come out. So, there are certain hot spots in the country that are driving a lot of the storage developments. We have California, we have Massachusetts, New York now with their big mandate coupled with many incentives. And then right now, ERCOT, whether you know it or not, is actually a huge hotspot. People are rushing in, trying to put in storage. And the reason being, not just because of policy on the state level, like I was referring to the mandates and the procurement targets, but what's happening on a level lower than that, and that's what's happening within the market. So in ERCOT, for example, there's a lot of market redesign that happens. So last year, we had Nodal Protocol revision. It was NPRR 863. And that's where ERCOT introduced ERCOT Contingency Reserve Service, ECRS, and they also made revisions to our Responsive Reserve Service. They're both just fancy words for grid services. But what happened is because of those revisions, they essentially created a new opportunity for fast and flexible resources like storage to come in. And they carved out a pretty nice allotment of megawatts for resources like batteries. So what that does is it creates price signals. And when there's price signals, people will come and they will build. So without the mandates, there is price signals, but they're very limited. The marketplaces are very finite. So once these the early adopters take advantage of the price signals, and those are done and they go away, we need those mandates and the incentives to continue driving deployments.
Kurt, do you have thoughts on that?
I'll touch on it from another angle, the federal standpoint, ITC credit. So, that very important has been to date, especially for battery storage due to the higher capital costs associated with battery storage. And if it is coupled with a PV system, you can get the full ITC benefit of it. Obviously, that is being phased out. It's going to drop down to 10% by 2022. And, everybody's watching to see if that's going to be extended or not. Most people feel like that, or there's a group that feels like it should be extended. Another group obviously says no more government subsidies. It should be able to stand on its own 2 legs and be justified that way. Where we see the trend for costs continuing to go down, we feel like it's going to be competitive regardless. Even if the ITC is not there, that costs will continue to come down. It will be a competitive generation resource. PV plus storage, obviously, if it's extended, it helps. But I think that's one of the main ones from a federal standpoint. And I agree from a state standpoint, especially ERCOT and even other states, it's not well defined, and it does need to be so that you can capture all the revenue bucket streams associated with storage. And I think it'll come. It's just going to take time. All of the ISOs are working on it. Everything from the capacity allocation of it to, the ancillary service piece of it. And it'll come. It's just going to take time. And like the other panel said, we have to be patient. But we have to keep pushing on it.
Yeah, don't be too patient.
Push.
That's really the biggest thing that everybody's waiting for, right? Is the ITC going down, truly? That's what we're expecting, right? Or will it stick around, hopefully? But that's the two we're at a fork in the road right now. And we have to say, is it going to be no ITC or the 10%? Or is it going to be that we're going to be able to renew it, essentially, with the government? But given that battery prices are continuing to come down year over year, we have big firms like Bloomberg that will put out numbers of projections of battery price declines, and they'll say numbers like the batteries are going down 15% a year. And that's a little misleading because they're talking about battery cells, okay? What you're buying is battery modules. So once you take into account the price of racking and the fact that racking doesn't come down as quickly as cells, you're looking at about an 8% landed cost or an 8% decrease year over year. So you take that 8% decrease year over year and then you phase out the ITC. What you get in 5 years is you get the same price as today. So if there's anybody in the room that's waiting for prices to come down, if that ITC goes away, you might as well buy today. I didn't mean to try to sell storage. I'm sure the developers are all clapping like, yeah, buy it today. but it's true. It's just I think people are just expecting prices to just keep coming down and coming down. But there's a lot of elements that go into pricing, and then certain technologies, the prices are going up. Just this past year and a half, we had this emergence of a lot of Chinese lithium iron phosphates. They're called LFPs coming into the marketplace. And if you are a utility procuring storage, you'd be like, ooh, and the prices are so low. I want to buy these LFP cells. And now, if you're trying to buy LFP cells, you're getting hit with that 15% tariff. And you're going to find out that most banks aren't willing to finance you because they're from China. So there's a lot of things that happen. So sometimes procrastinating on waiting to go forward with batteries or solar plus storage, sometimes it can actually bite you in the butt.
We did a recent analysis for one of our repeat utility customers in California. They had a similar view, and they said, well, we're just going to wait a few years because price is coming down. Well, they have storage mandates in California, so they needed quite a bit of storage. And we were talking about a smaller piece, and at the end of the day, we told them, we said, well, give us what you think prices are going to go down to and what you can contract for. And what we ended up showing them was not only from an MPV standpoint, but from what you're going to learn, you're better off to go ahead and install this smaller system now so you get the experience of a battery, and then because you're still going to need more later. And when you put in that next system, you'll have the learnings from it. Plus, if you deferred this one, you would still, from an MPV standpoint, you're better off to put it in today. It was a really interesting and eye-opening analysis for them. And then they ultimately did do that.
When utilities ask for batteries in an RFP, the developer has to find a way to pay for that battery. The additional cost or the adder of the uplift in the capacity payment or the PPA price, the way that they get that price is they have to figure out ways of paying for the batteries. So what do is they go to the market and they say, how much money can I make from doing energy shifting? How much money can I make from doing regulation or spinning reserves or capacity? And it all gets baked into offsetting the price of the batteries. And that's how they're able to subsidize the solar PPA price or the blended PPA price. So by waiting, what happens is these revenue streams, they're getting diluted because more and more batteries are getting built. There's competition in the marketplace. So if somebody is subsidizing their battery costs by doing, say, regulation today, they're making great capacity clearing prices. But if they do that 3 or 4 years from now, that revenue stream is getting diluted. So they're not able to subsidize the solar PPA prices effectively.
Can I go back to the investment tax credit Kurt's mentioned, and there is some discussion about whether storage will specifically, in DC, storage will specifically be allowed to take advantage of it, even if it isn't coupled with solar. And obviously that has advantages. It helps buy down the price, it makes the project more attractive. Have any of you, in your professional lives, do you deal with tax equity? Is that a thing? And okay, so a handful. It's hard. You know, tax equity, they really do call the shots at the end of the day on these deals. And then they also, because if you're a certain kind of entity, for example, if you're a municipal entity or a co-op, electric co-op, you don't have the tax appetite and you can't participate. And in fact, your involvement is limited and you can't own these assets. So I think that when we think about incentives, things like the ITC have been an enormous driver of value, but I think they've also really stifled a lot of the creative financial solutions we might be able to come up with if we didn't have tax equity involved in all of these deals. So I don't think anyone here controls what incentives we get, but you know, the ITC is a complex one for sure, as is the production tax credit for wind.
So on the last panel, we heard a lot about partnerships, but there are also a lot of competing interests in these bigger projects. So how can the industry manage the challenges to creating a business case for solar plus storage when there are all these competing interests?
I mean, I think it really comes down to contracting for the right project. Being sure that you address the needs of your system. And if you do that, and where prices are going, prices continue to come down, and if it's priced competitively, it sells itself. I mean, because it is, what's your alternative? Typically, if you start looking at fossil-fired generation, installing new generation, the new PV plus storage prices are going to beat that. They just are, and it's going to continue to be that way going forward. So as long as you're really taking into account what your system needs and you're quantifying what the revenue buckets are that it's going to be able to achieve for you, then to me, it sells itself.
I agree.
So what do you all envision the future of the solar plus storage industry or market looking like, maybe 5 years from now?
I think PV plus storage is going to be the new norm. Adding the storage to it. It's coming, and we're seeing it already, and it's going to continue to grow as the technology continues to increase, prices continue to come down. Don't get me wrong, we're never going to get rid 100% of fossil-fired generation. There's a place for that too. This is just fitting a gap that's needed in there, and it's coming down to you need that quicker response time. We're seeing that if you go back, date myself a little here, 15, 20 years ago when I first started in this industry, when you had disruptions in a system, it lasted days. 10 years ago, it lasted many, many hours, maybe a full day, because it just took time to bring the new generation online. What are we seeing now? Take away extreme heat like we've had the last couple of weeks, but get out of that time period, what do you see? It's all intra-hour volatility because systems are responding quicker to it. And a lot of that has to do with the ISOs having their fingers on more generation to be able to pull from to correct problems. But that's what this industry is coming to. So, you need something that can respond very quickly. You need something that's got the correct software to be able to tie in, to be able to respond so that you are capturing those time periods. And I think that's where it's headed. And it's going to be a large chunk of the generation fleets going forward.
Yeah, I think we can definitely envision that price will keep coming down, and I think we touched on that earlier. I agree, PV plus S or solar plus storage, whatever your acronym of choice is, that will continue to reign, and we're going to see more and more of that, especially from procurements of utilities. I think that DC coupled systems will become easier and more efficient to install. The EPCs are getting better at that. The equipment is more readily available. If anything, the only obstacle right now is just that your DC-DC converters are really at max. They're available at 500 kW, so you're kind of throttled on how much storage you can put in with the bigger solar facilities. I think we're going to see a lot more solar plus storage, DG style on distribution. that's what utilities, especially here in Texas, need, because the peaks are getting later. You know, all this distributed and community solar that people have put in years ago, the DER programs that utilities started years ago, they're starting to fail because the peaks are getting shifted later in the evening. So maybe now you have like 30 or 35% of your solar still available during 4CP windows. Well, guess what? It's going to be less and less and less every year as the peaks shift. So you need batteries in there to be able to clip your peaks to save on transmission fees. I think lithium is still going to be at the top of the block. I am anxiously sitting on the sideline waiting to see if LFP or Chinese LFP batteries are going to become bankable from financiers. Some banks are willing to finance BYD batteries out of China. Most banks are not willing to finance Chinese LFP batteries. I think on the technology side, we're also going to see, obviously, energy density is going to keep increasing. Samsung just came out with their new modules, another 5% increase in energy density, which is incredible. We're going to see a lot more safety and redundancy in battery storage systems. And this is something that came from the recent fires in Korea, and then also Arizona Public Service's fire. Some things came to light. So we're seeing, gravitation from the standard or traditional smoke detection into maybe a more conservative approach where you're doing rack-level gas-based detection systems. There's more redundancy in the rack level where there is more contactors for increased safety and reliability. There's more fusing connections to be able to disconnect modules that are misbehaving or to shut them down. So there's a lot more safety that we're seeing, especially on the modules. Now there's detection methods so that you know if a module's been dropped. So definitely more on safety. And then we're going to see, from a procurement standpoint, hopefully, as a result of some of the things that have happened recently, we're going to see more specifications related to standards, safety, fire suppression systems, and then also more development and security types of fees to ensure that, hey, if I'm a utility and I'm going to do business with you, Mr. Developer, I want to make sure that you do it right and you do it when you say you're going to do it, especially now because the ITC is phasing out. There's a lot of economics that are baked into achieving certain milestones by a certain date. So we're going to see more fees, I think, and securities on the procurement side.
I think we're going to see greater professionalization in the developer community. And I think that's really a reaction to, in my view, almost anyone can develop a solar project. The barrier to entry is low. It's pretty easy to do. You don't have the resource differentiation that you have with wind. And so we've seen a lot of solar companies, many of them very thinly capitalized, very, very small outfits. And I think for solar, that's fine. I don't think it's really much of a problem. Storage is different. There are security concerns. There are real, installation complexities. And I work for RES as a development and construction company, and the construction around storage, it has some real issues around it that things have to be done well. And I think what this means is that I think utilities and others who are procuring will really look more carefully at who they're contracting with, because storage is just a lot harder, and solar plus storage is a lot harder than solar alone.
I think we have time for one question, if anybody has a question. Right here.
Thank you. I'm Pramod Kulkarni with Customized Energy Solutions. And my question is, we've been talking about the lithium-ion batteries cost coming down, almost like a, gospel truth that this will keep coming down. And Judith, you mentioned that flow batteries come in, flow batteries go out, and things like that. The question is, as a developer, given the fact that there's demand for electric vehicles with lithium-ion, and supplies aren't coming on that quickly, as a developers, how concerned, if at all you are, with putting all your eggs in one lithium-ion basket? And two, what are the alternatives? Are you looking at other chemistries, low batteries, or what are the limitations?
I think supply chain risk is always going to be an issue. We manage a lot of RFPs for utilities, and one thing that we want a bidder to show us is that they have the supply. Give me a letter from Samsung or LG or BYD showing me that you have X amount of batteries set aside for you that falls in line with your detailed project schedule. And the reason why we do that now is because last year there was a huge run on the battery module market. Korea put out some substantial incentives and targets, and all of the modules of specific chemistries were getting sucked out of the marketplace. So we had this synthetic supply issue. And that happens also on the solar side, right? When the tariffs were about to hit, what do people do? They stock up. Similar to how when we think there's going to be a tornado, you run to the store and you buy like 20 cases of water, right? So it's the same mentality. So it's important that you, as from a procurement standpoint, that you have that taken care of, if you're going to be a buyer. But you're right. I mean, that's always a possibility. And what happens is your smaller developers will lose that race. You have big companies like, I don't want to say names, but one that comes to mind would be like a Nextera. They got huge volume purchasing power. They go to an LG or a Samsung, guess what? They're at the top of the list. They're going to get it before some of the smaller developers will. So that's just the honest reality of it. It's a price war, it's a supply war, and the bigger, stronger companies will win in the end.
How about Reza? 8 minutes. What's your stand on?
Well, a couple of things with that. One, yes, I mean, could be supply constraints. There's also what we feel like you've really got to pay attention to is quality constraints. We have an R&D center where we're constantly testing modules, we're testing batteries, we're testing our software system that integrates, et cetera. And we're also talking to them to find out who are the right ones to partner with on a longer term basis. We are big on partnering with suppliers, with our suppliers. And, but I think you have to be very careful, not that just you have quantity coming in, but you have quality coming in. And we tend to put as much or more emphasis on the quality side as the quantity.
There really isn't an easy answer to this excellent question. You have to worry about your supply chain. You have to worry about costs. My first boss many years ago at Res said, "This is not a business for sissies," and I think I'm going to leave it at that.
All right, well, that is a great quote to end on. Thank you so much to all our panelists. Please join me in thanking them. And if you have more questions for them, time for lunch.